Hello, and welcome to the AIRC Insights webinar. Can test labs bridge the gap between defense policy designs and outcomes? I'm Arun Seraphin, a fellow at the AIRC, the Acquisition Innovation Research Center, housed within Stevens Institute of Technology, and also the executive director of NDIA's Emerging Technologies Institute. And I'm pleased to be the host of the first in a series of AIRC Insights webinars. This series is planned to draw on AIRC's research to engage thought leaders from both government, industry, and academia to have discussions on relevant topics in acquisition and transformation. Throughout the webinar, we're going to welcome topical questions in the Q&A box, and any other questions or comments you might have, please put in the chat box. At the end of the session, I'm going to pull questions from the Q&A box and feed them to our distinguished panel. So on today's topic of policy modeling, test labs, and previewing the future of acquisition, the way I think about this is that today complex defense policy decisions for things like organizational planning or supply chain management or even acquisition policy, they're often made without full consideration of downstream effects. For example, new NDAA provisions or FAR regulations or the removal of current rules are not adequately modeled for the decision makers and policymakers to think about all of the potential impacts of their actions. This lack of ability to model and test out policy solutions before they're implemented can often result in additional bureaucracy, additional cost, and other unintended consequences. So one thought is that a more robust application of the Pentagon's existing powerful modeling and simulation enterprise and the powerful computer simulation capabilities that exist, they can be used to forecast policy consequences before implementation of good ideas, and therefore enable more informed policymaking. For example, through capabilities that we're going to see today at AIRC's Acquisition Policy Test Lab. The panelists today in this panel are going to try to examine how modeling of policy questions is going to be beneficial to the defense enterprise. They'll discuss potential use cases for the AIRC Test Lab and other equivalent modeling and simulation instruments, and then turn over some of the key enablers that would allow policy modeling to become a more effective tool to improve acquisition overall. Now I'm honored to introduce our panelists. First, Ms. Lynn Williams. She's a senior professional staff member at the House Armed Services Committee and a great former colleague of mine. She served over a decade on the Hill, in addition to previous senior roles with both industry and the Boeing Corporation, other government roles in the Congressional Research Service, and then, of course, as an active duty F-15C pilot in the U.S. Air Force. Joining her is Dr. Doug Bittner. He's the Deputy Chief Scientist of the Acquisition Innovation Research Center, or AIRC. He's got over 30 years of industry experience in the engineering of aerospace and software-intensive systems for the Pentagon and NASA. This includes significant time at the Aerospace Corporation. And finally, Mike Madsen. He's VP of National Security Strategy at Obvient, which is a company providing strategic intelligence for defense acquisition. Previously, he was the VP for Government Relations at Strider Technologies and also director of the part of the department's Defense Innovation Unit. He was also previously the staff director of the Acquisition Reform 809 panel. Mike is also a former Air Force. He served 22 years in the U.S. Air Force as a pilot, legislative liaison, and programming officer. So Doug, Lynn, Mike, thank you for joining us. And I'm going to start, Lynn, if you could start up the panel for us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Arun. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm really excited to be here. I'm excited about this topic. You know, I'm not here today to speak on behalf of the Armed Services Committee or Congress writ large, but just from my personal experience, I think everyone is generally aware that policy changes can rarely be implemented without having some sort of offsetting, if not undesirable effect. You know, you often hear this play out in debate over policy. those in favor, speak about all the values of a proposed policy, while those opposed talk about all the negative effects or the consequences of a policy. And the federal procurement and industrial-based policies that I work on, they're complex. There are oftentimes multiple key stakeholders, and each of them can be affected in a different way. And it can vary not only on the key policy objective, but just in simply the way the Department of Defense implements the policy. And I've learned over time that most policy changes are not free. What I mean by that is that it's not just the agency's cost to develop and implement new policy guidance, but it's the changes prescribed in the policy can actually really either slow down the system or cause a lot of actual financial cost or overhead with a lot of other entities that have to be brought on board to maintain and certify compliance. And so as we think about the benefits of a policy, we need to also think about some of these, second and third order consequences. And I always am aware that there are unintended consequences that I'm generally not aware of when we work on policy. And that's why I think that this potential tool could be really, really helpful and insightful for us to figure out, what is the balance in this policy? How do we think about writing it? And what would be the unintended consequences as the department takes it and begins to implement it? So with that said, I'll turn it back over to the rest of the panel.
Yeah, Lynn, so it's great to hear that perspective and that there might be a real opportunity here to help shape maybe future NDAAs or future FAR changes through use of this kind of capability. Thank you for pointing things like that out. I'm going to turn it over now to Doug. Doug, can you tell us a little bit about what's going on at the Policy Test Lab?
So first, I just want to mention that, it's not just me. There is a team behind this. We've had wonderful contributions from Dr. Saremi, who's an AIRC research scientist. Ethan Silverstein is a grad student, and he'll be graduating this term. And then I've also had some great inputs from my co-PI, Zoe, and don't ask me to pronounce her last name, Zushin Farber. But just to kind of level set everybody, Lynn did a great job kind of, explaining part of the problem is, once you have a problem identified in the policy arena, it takes quite a while for us to go through all the hoops, if you will, to consider a solution, to actually, put the statute in place, get it into an NDAA, negotiate it back and forth between the different stakeholders in Congress, and then the statute to reinforce the solution, and then for the DoD to actually implement a solution. And then to sit around and twiddle your thumbs and wait to see whether or not that, solution that you've implemented actually works. And so this takes a long period of time, and not all agencies are the same. I mean, we have, for example, the National Institutes of Health does lots of great policy examples. And I will specifically talk to one of those here in a second, as soon as I can change the slides. If you're at home, if you want to just do a quick screen grab of this slide, because I'll be talking to it probably quite a bit. But putting the Policy Test Lab in the middle and thinking about it from that perspective, this is kind of what my operational view looks like, ROV1 from DoD, DODAF vernacular. So basically, I have some policy owners with a question, right? And that can take different forms. It could be just a quick email, hey, I've got a question on this kind of a policy, or it could be, here's the new statute. Can we go off and model this before we actually try to go towards an implementation? So I've got the inputs on the left-hand side here. So I've got, I have to go look off at different official policy parameters, whatever those may be, existing operational data. And then when you get to agent-based models, we definitely want to have behavioral and population data information, economic information. Then I've always got, different kinds of constraints, privacy issues, and things of that nature. So these are what would get fed into a policy test lab, right? And down at the base on the bottom, if you want to think, and we're going to do bottoms up, now what I can do is I can do what if exploration, doing different different types of models. I can play with different policy levers. I can do uncertainty analysis, doing just different statistics analysis types approaches, trade-off analysis. So there's a lot I can do on that side. And then I'd kind of feed that, once I was all done with all that, over to the decision makers. And you can kind of think of this as communicating on both sides. It wouldn't just be a one-way arrow. But once the committees and stakeholders have had a chance to take a look at, what the analysis showed, you can think of then the statute and the legal changes, for example, for acquisition reform, the BFR, DFARS change. And then for the policy test lab, the best thing to do is now have in that DFARS change what data, that I could then go mine to see how that policy is actually going forth and whether or not my model was well calibrated. And so now to just kind of go through a demo of what we currently have implemented. I'm just going to walk you through this. I'll play it. So when I mentioned the National Institutes of Health, I've been doing modeling and stuff for quite some time. And so one of the things I knew is that there's actually been a lot of investigations on, believe it or not, chocolate milk as a school staple item for lunches and even potentially breakfasts in some cases. So now the question is, okay, what if I did what I call an antithesis model policy where I'm telling my chat agent here, I want to actually have all kids drink chocolate milk. And so, being a mom or a dad, you say, well, what about the health impacts, right? What about childhood obesity and things like that? So what you're seeing me here is literally just typing in the policy question. And now I'm going to hit enter. It's now going off to ChatGPT, the large language model, to start thinking about what I call a scenario. And that scenario will identify all the risks. It will identify the different agents, like the child, the teacher, and school officials, your doctors, and what have you, right? So that all comes back here. Now I'm going to do is I'm going to send it out for research. And now what's going off, it's thinking and looking for papers applicable to my policy question. And it can go through and it'll find some decent papers. And now when we built this, we can actually go off and say, okay, let me send all these off to my paper search. I can also, if I've done this a few times, or maybe even I just went off and searched really quickly on ChatGPT or even Google and found some papers, I can literally just drag and drop them in here. And now what will happen is the models will be analyzed, or the papers will be analyzed for models. And here you see an example of, it found a systems dynamics model in this one paper. And actually, if you go look at the paper very carefully, it doesn't have the model in it, but it discusses the model and the outputs. And so we've been able to actually get the agents to go off and create a model based on the discussion in the paper. And I mean, we found this extremely powerful. And this is a lot of Dr. Sarami's work. I've got a very simple system dynamics model that came out here. I can run it. I can move it back and forth. Key thing is I can play with the parameters, right? I can say, well, this is what the paper had in it. What if I tweak these one or two other parameters? I can even go in and add parameters. And so the idea is now you'd have these results go into this section. This would be the system dynamics model. Maybe I have an agent-based model. Then I could go off and I could run that agent-based model also and put these inputs in here. But the key thing is now I can start playing with them. This becomes a base model that I can utilize. It's all implemented in Python, so it uses SymPy, which is a library to build things up. I don't need to have these very expensive modeling tools available to me. So that kind of just shows a quick preview of what we built. Some example policy questions, just sitting down and thinking through it, and knowing Lynn is an industrial-based policy is her key thing that she thinks about. It's like, what could I do in industrial-based policy? Well, I could look at new incentives and penalties, and then utilize existing data to think about how and model how that would change things. I could start playing with innovations in the marketplace. sustainment cost reduction, potentially different ways of trying to reduce that. The Buy America First versus NATO partnering approach, supply chain resilience, for example, raw materials. That's all over the news lately. And then just recently found this one where in FY25, and there were changes in the FY26 NDA for qualification of industrial capabilities. Potentially, we can speed things up by using just normal, non-traditional DoD players and whatever they do to certify their capability in the marketplace. We can go after reform policy changes, secondary, tertiary effects. Look at DoD benefits from American infrastructure investments. And then acquisition approach decisions, for example, upgrade old or buy new trade-offs, which always comes up, especially with major weapon systems. And so the key things now to actually make this operational is we need to go from that very simple model you saw created in the demo to being able to do more complex models. That's going to be probably our next big thing we put in. And then be able to transition this into a CUI environment, controlled and classified data, to where we can access data from Advana, the DoD's, I would say, data warehouse, and then model directly from data and validated pre-existing models. And then the next step after that was in try and take the DoD policy documents we have and map those into existing models and data, and then identify whatever gaps we have in both in terms of models and data. And that pretty much covers it, Arun.
That's great, Doug. Thanks very much. A lot to digest there and think about the possibilities here. Okay, Mike, I want to turn it over to you, and I want you to tap into your industry experience, your government experience, your staffer experience, to tell us what you think about this world of potentially policy testing, policy modeling.
Thanks, Ram, and thanks for pointing out that I really can't hold down a job, so I appreciate that. And thanks for including me in this critically important conversation. It's a very important issue, so thank you. And Doug, thank you for that walkthrough. It's very interesting. For everyone in the audience, so what Doug just showed us is the predictive side of this problem. Given a policy change, what happens? And what I want to do is spend a couple minutes on what makes that difficult from the multiple hats I wear, as Arun pointed out, because I think it's worth naming the infrastructure challenges underneath all of this, and then talk about where I sit today in industry, and I think what this kind of capability can unlock going forward. Look, the honest truth here is that most acquisition policy gets made the way that it always has, and we've all participated in this. It's through experience, it's through instinct, advocacy, political negotiations, and those aren't bad inputs, but what's almost always missing is the evidence to back up what we think the change is going to be. As Arun pointed out, I was part of the 809 Congressional Advisory Panel on Streamlining Defense Acquisition. And we had a room full of some of the most experienced acquisition practitioners in the country. And we spent a good bit of time on the question of what changes would actually improve the system. And they were great conversations. They were smart people, but they were fundamentally philosophical conversations because we didn't have a way to test the hypothesis in real time. We could argue from an experience perspective about what raising the simplified acquisition threshold, for example, might do, or what another domestic sourcing mandate would actually accomplish. But we couldn't model it. And we couldn't say, hey, here's what the data shows, happened the last times that we tried something like this, and then use that going forward to make decisions. Take the Buy American for an example. This concept comes up constantly. Every few years it resurfaces. There's a new provision, a new mandate, a new set of domestic sourcing restrictions, and everyone in the room has a view on it. Industry certainly has a view. The Hill has a view. The Pentagon has a view. But has anyone ever actually measured whether the last mandate improved the industrial base, or whether it changed supplier behavior, or whether it had the second and third order effects on cost or schedule or competition or any of those other things that we use to measure program? And the answer in most cases is that no. and we pass that policy and we move on. And that's the gap that it appears to me that this tool is definitely designed to close. Now, Lynn described some of those second and third order effects problems really well from a Hill perspective. And I'd say the same thing exists inside the building. When I was at CAPE, Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, and when I was at the Defense Innovation Unit, the question was always, hey, look, is this policy actually going to change the behavior in the way that we want? And the answer, honestly, in most cases was, we didn't know, because no one had ever built up to then a feedback loop to fully find out. And really, for a long time, we didn't have the tools to build it. The compute power wasn't there. We're seeing the compute power now. Artificial intelligence certainly wasn't there. Data infrastructure wasn't there. To this day, a lot of data is unstructured. It's not clean. It needs to be cleansed, organized, even added. I'm surprised how much data is actually missing. And that's what's changed recently. And what Doug has shown you today wasn't possible probably 5 years ago, and maybe even more recent than that, at any reasonable cost. So the question is no longer, can we do this? Because the technology is there. It really becomes a cultural and an incentive issue. The question really is, hey, do we have the institutional will to use this and get after it from there? But in my mind, before you can have a policy test lab, there's a couple of foundational problems that have to be solved. And I don't think they get enough attention. And they really surfaced from my time at Avian. And the first is fragmentation. Look, the 1.5 trillion now defense marketplace operates on a whole series of disparate data, whether it's in PDFs, on people's desktops, all of those things. And so the defense data has been siloed almost by design for a long time. Programs, budgets, appropriations, contracts, performance, et cetera, all of those things. They all live in different systems, often on individual desktops with different owners, different update cycles. And you can't model policy effects across the landscape if you can't connect the data in the first place. The second challenge that I see is the ontology problem. Everyone uses the same words to mean different things. Program, for example. The word program means something different in the budget shop than it does to the contracting office, than it does to the program manager. And before we can even analyze across all those domains, we have to build a common language. And look, I know it's unsexy work, but it's foundational to getting after this problem. And I would actually argue that it's probably the hardest part of this entire effort, is getting everyone to speak the same language and to agree on, like I said, what a problem is. And the third problem that I see, in front of us right now is data latency. By the time some data is available, clean, accessible, all those things I talked about before, the policy decisions have probably already been made. So real-time or near real-time data integration isn't a nice to have for something like this. It is actually a requirement for that. So those kind of the problems I see. Now I want to spend just a little bit of time on where I sit today, because I think it's directly relevant. Avian was built to solve exactly this problem, not in the abstract, but specifically for the acquisition workforce that lives with it every day. We built a platform that ingests, normalizes, connects acquisition data across programs, vendors, organizations, comptroller functions in near real time. And the core of that work is the ontology problem that I described. In fact, the founders of Avian spent a couple years mapping and building out an ontology. And so before we surface a single insight, we map the data, programs to organizations, organizations to funding line, vendors to contracts, contracts to program health indicators. And that mapping is the infrastructure that really makes any kind of policy modeling even more powerful from there. So the thing that really surprised me about how much value there is in just making those connections visible. A lot of what passes for analysis, I mean, I lived it in CAPE, is just manually reconciling data across systems that were never designed to talk to each other. And so we're replacing that with dashboards where a programmer or a PAE can actually see the linkages between budget decisions, contract action, between vendor relationships and program dependency in a single view. It sounds basic, but it's not. And it turns out that once you make a lot of those connections, policy questions become much, much sharper that then you can start putting in a lab and getting predictive outputs on. And again, so what Doug showed you is that predictive layer that I mentioned. Given a policy, change, simulate an outcome. And what we're trying to do is make the data, the underlying data, legible enough so that that simulation has something real to work with. And in fact, one could argue that we work a little bit as a very primitive test bed for that. When an SAE asks about industrial base risk across the portfolio, or a PAE asked about budget exhibits if a program accelerates. Those are policy modeling questions, but those are at the program and portfolio level. The next step, in my mind, is scaling this from portfolio level to enterprise level, and from descriptive to predictive, and then prescriptive. Think about the power of that. What does a policy change due to acquisition cycle times across the services, for example? Or contracting threshold adjustments due to small business participation. These are all answerable questions in that predictive and prescriptive environment. And I'll also add that, look, industry has a stake in this too. Companies are trying to articulate second and third order effects of policies that they support or oppose. And historically, they have had no good way to do that beyond lobbying or anecdotal evidence. And so if the data infrastructure matures, that certainly changes. So in my mind, descriptive plus predictive is ultimately what makes a test policy lab incredibly useful. And the reason I'm excited about what Doug is building is it has potential to shift conversations. Hey, we think this will work, to, hey, here's what the model says. Here's what the model is uncertain about. And here's what we need to see to have more confidence in that. That's a fundamentally different basis than anything we've ever had before. And I'd also say for anyone in the audience that's skeptical about this, that's probably the right posture right now. The right question is, hey, do you believe in policy modeling? The question is, hey, what would it take for you to trust the output? And how do we get from here to there? And that is certainly a question that we can work forward to answering. Look, it's a different kind of problem that we're working on. We're not there yet, but the path is clear, and I'm incredibly excited to watch this and be part of it.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, and it's a key point you made that without access to the data, awareness of the data, mapping of the data, it's going to be really impossible to build these models. And so what your company is doing is very important. And I think the other important piece of having industry in this discussion is that, in my opinion, all good AIRC research eventually will transition over to the industrial side for either their use or to provide back as services to the department. That's kind of the whole point of funding this kind of fundamental, maybe applied research. The kinds of stuff that Doug is doing is not just to do the research, but then to transition it for its actual use in the system. I'd invite the audience to submit questions under the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we've got some questions already coming in. But before we go to those, I actually want to have the panelists talk a little bit about what they just heard, starting with you, Lynn. So what do you think about both what Doug just demonstrated and then Mike's overlay over it, and how do you think it might be useful or not useful to what you do for a living now?
Well, thanks, Vern. I was really excited by what Doug had to share there. And, Mike did a great job, too, of talking about the state of the present and the reality that we sit in right now. And I was beginning to sort of think about the things that we have in our toolkit today to deal with those uncertainties of the negative impacts of policy. And in most cases, the answer is a waiver, right? We put a waiver in the statute to say, if we got this wrong, somebody at a very high level can just waive this. And if you think about the reality of that, if all these waivers have to be executed, that's an extraordinary amount of paperwork that lands on the Secretary of Defense's desk, right? So that's not good use of anyone's time either. But it is that sort of pressure release valve for some of these policies that we're uncertain about. And then I think the other tool we have is the world famous pilot program. And I know you've been behind some of those, right? Well, we'll just make this a pilot program and give it a sunset date, and then we'll figure out over the next couple of years whether this is a good policy or a bad policy. And the reality is that oftentimes those pilot programs don't get funded, or there's a change of administration and they don't get fully executed, or there's no follow-up by the Congress to get feedback on whether the policy is something that we should make permanent. And so I think that what Doug showed would enable a much faster feedback loop, and that's something Doug mentioned, Mike mentioned, to enable us to make better policy decisions that won't unintentionally, but sort of intentionally, bog down the whole system for a while we try to figure out if this is going to work. So a question for Doug, you talked about critical minerals in your supply chain risk in your overview, and so I'm going to ask you a tough question. I deal with policy recommendations and every NDAA by someone wanting to place a statutory prohibition on a procurement of a particular mineral or metal from China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And those minerals and materials are all varied. They're varied in sources, they're varied in ability to stockpile. There's all kinds of complexity in that, as well as in the way the Department of Defense and its contractors use and utilize those materials in defense systems. So is the model ready for that sort of complexity? And if not, what do you need to get you there?
Great question. So right now, if I was to put the complexity of model that it can currently handle on a scale from 1 to 10, I would say probably the system dynamics and discrete events probably at about a 1. And then agent base is probably more at about a 2. And it might be 1 to 2, 2 to 3, in there somewhere. So I'm not there yet, right? But now there is a very clear path to move to where I can easily handle probably complex models in the order of 5 to 7. And then even more complex models we've also got in development path timeline, an idea that might even be able to take us up to a 9, 10. And it's all going to be computational power, right? And so I think we can get there. There's a clear path, so I'm not overly concerned. Timeline, if that's kind of what you're asking, I'm thinking 3 to 6 months maybe. So I don't think it'll take too long. It's just a matter of telling my grad students to start pounding out code. So
thanks for that. I appreciate it.
So you mentioned the agentic models, and I was just curious, as there is going to be this explosion on the use of these kinds of agentic AI. And Mike, I think you guys are working on that. So how do you think this factors in here?
Yeah, thanks, Rune. And Doug, you just mentioned in your answer back to Lynn, I took a note on it, the agent base. And I find that whole landscape fascinating. I mean, ChatGPT exploded on the scene not that long ago, fairly recently. And then the rate of change since then from ChatGPT to all the other agentic platforms that we see now, it's an incredible increase in capability. So how do you see that agentic explosion supporting the development of your policy testbed?
Oh, wow. It's been foundational. I mean, I honestly don't think I could be where I am without it. Because I just started doing it myself, and then I was using the agentic AI capabilities in ChatGPT to start the code, because I'm not a Python programmer, and Python's the clear language for doing this work. So just to get going, it laid the foundation of everything I need to do. And then as I've gotten it to a certain point, we've been able to bring on additional researchers, like as we could see there was a there, right? And then now I've got, I would say, the foundation built to where now I can just have my ChatGPT Codex models going in, and I can just say, literally add this functionality, and probably in about 15 minutes, I've got all that new functionality in there. Whereas even 6 to 9 months ago, when I said that, I'd then spend the next week or two debugging it. I'm not having to do as much of that anymore. I mean, sometimes there may be a little thing I have to change here and there, but I mean, just building it has been foundational. I can't wait till I can start using these more advanced models. I don't know if you noticed, but I had the 2 models that I was using in it to just do that chat interaction, and I wasn't using the latest and greatest models. I'm using 2 or 3 generations old, and it's been the way we've been doing it, just to help contain costs, right?
Yeah.
So I'm excited about it. I really am. And it's going to be fun getting what I'll call the move from kind of a prototype over into an actual tool that I can then start tackling some of these harder problems.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. I mean, the power of shifting from keyword search to, using straight language and not even good grammar in my case.
Yeah.
I think it's a
Well,
fantastic.
you saw how many times I misspelled words as I was typing it out, right? I could have kept those misspelled words in there, and I've done this, and I still get the right answer out. So it's
Right.
fantastic. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And I don't know what the limitations are on the technology at this point, but I know the world that Lynn is operating in, there are a lot of powerful individual agents who, who have very strong points of view. And I know in my past, gee, it would have been nice for me to understand where all the landmines were and who is going to say what to me to let me just make one or two fewer missteps on the way. Um, Doug, my question for you is more along the lines of traditional modeling and simulation, where we do modeling and simulation of everything under the sun, whether it's big systems or body armor or chemistry, in the name of the department and its missions. But they have a very strong tradition of verification and validation of their models. And so, what's the maturity of how you are doing V&V on these models? And then, how's that the test lab taking that on as a mission?
That's a great question, Arun. One of the things I talked about is, just showing you building a model from scratch, right? I'm just going to existing literature out there, right? So there are two key things that we still want to be able to do. One is to just give it the problem, have it build a model from scratch. But the other thing is to now build a database of these models. And so with a database of the models, for example, I can go out there and I've already gotten from the Aerospace Corporation, thanks to some contacts I have there from my years there, have been able to get what they call the ERAM model, which is basically the best discrete event model of the 2010 era acquisition. The entire, it's got PPBE in it, it's got everything in it, but it just tells you discrete event just tells you how long it takes something to get done. With some in Monte Carlo, you can now put some error bars on that. We have that model now, but we just don't have it integrated in yet. And so the idea is, okay, we just got through, for example, taking JSIDs out of the equation. Great. What does that do to the existing model, and what are they going to replace it with? Once I know what that is, I can plug it in. Or if I even have ideas, I can plug it in. So there's things like that in your time on the PPB commission that we can now go into this existing model and compare it to the old one and use that existing model to now move forward. But the thing is, I don't have to sit there and I don't have to type in, I can just literally type in natural language. I need you to modify this by pulling out JSIDs, adding in this new capability, right? And then just sit back and wait for it to create the new model. And then the collaborative part of this is now start working with subject matter experts and the lawmakers and everybody and have an environment and I'll say, this is now what the model shows, right? Are you happy with this? Yes or no, right? Are there tweaks that we can make? And we can start doing that probably within, I'm going to say by next year timeframe, we have another one of these. I'll be able to show you some of that. And that's my goal.
So Lynn, we've got questions coming in for the audience, and this one follows off nicely from where Doug just left off. What would it take for you to use one of these policy modeling tools in your current work? What level of technical maturity for this test lab and for the ability to model policy would you be brave enough to explain to your bosses and the committee, yeah, we think this is going to work because the model says it's going to work?
Well, just like any good question, it deserves an "it all depends" answer. Like, who are the stakeholders involved? How important is this? No, I think I see this as just another evolving and emerging tool and capability. It's not, I would never take a singular input and use that as my decision line, right? This is just one more bit of information that can aid and either confirm or or change direction. And so I think it could be incredibly valuable, even in its nascent states, to begin to work with it and include it into the other analysis, experience, and professional judgment that I bring to the members of the committee as I support them.
Mike, this question I'm going to aim at you. In your view, what additional governance policy is going to be needed for the use of AI in doing this kind of analysis for decision-making on policy changes? It's sort of the policymaker in the loop question, I guess.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, that is a sticky question. Ultimately, that is a question. One thing we're realizing as we're working with folks in the Pentagon, they have a whole pile of data and they're just learning the power of that and what it can be used for, and it's fantastic. But I think what's becoming clear also is that there is no straightforward governance policy on that. Who stipulates what the authoritative source of data is? Who says that, for this area of data, the authoritative source is, this database? So often, and for those folks who have spent time in the Pentagon, data is pulled out of a authoritative source, data set, whatever, and it's put in spreadsheets, it's put in PowerPoints, and it's circulated around the Pentagon. Someone else picks that up and they pull the number out, maybe accurately or inaccurately, move the decimal point. And so the data starts to get corrupt through all of that. So I think, it's going to be a little bit of a cop-out answer, but I think that there needs to be a wholesale development of a high level degree of policy governance to start to direct those things.
Doug, another question coming in from the audience is about the data set. So tell us a little bit about the data sets you already have access to and are working on, and the data sets that it would really be helpful for you to have access to really ask some more complex policy questions.
Yeah, good question. So right now I'm trying to, as I've been building this out in the wild, if you will, we've just been using, for example, my chocolate milk example. I do have 2 acquisition reform questions. One is more industrial-based policy, and then the third one is literally acquisition reform based that I was using. So everything's been out in the open in terms of data sets and literature and everything of that nature. I'm excited to get it moved into a controlled and classified information environment, to where now I can start utilizing more official data from the department, and then eventually, hopefully move it up into even higher classifications. But the plan and the roadmap right now is for us to start moving it probably into this Virginia Tech Darcy environment. I'm going to say in the 3 to 6 month time frame.
This is a question for maybe all of you. And it's about how the models are built and the complexity of policy modeling as a whole. So the question is, how can policy be translated into experimental hypotheses that then can be tested in terms of outcome measures? So I'll break it apart a little bit. Lynn, when you're thinking about writing NDAA provisions, how do you think about measurable outcome metrics at this point?
There's so much in precedent, right? That was probably going to be my first comment about this, is that there's rarely a new policy that I've seen. It's just the same policy that's been reshaped, proposed policy that's been reshaped for a particular issue at a particular time. And so a lot of this work is repetitive, and you see these things coming back time and again, maybe just on a different topic. But so I think that there's experience in how prior policy was implemented and whether or not it was effective. But I think fundamentally, at the end of the day, you have to start with where you ended your question, which is, what's the policy objective? What are you trying to achieve? And if you're clear about that, then the rest of it is almost, there's almost a formula for it to get you from where you are to where you want to be with your policy objective. And so I think that in terms of developing the tool to enable that modeling, I think that there's decades of law that could underpin that with precedent. even if the topic of the policy is slightly varied. And from there, we can garner, I think, a bit more data. One that has always fascinated me, and Mike brought it up in his comments earlier, does the Buy America Act really create American jobs? To me, that's a question where I actually don't think the data exists. But aside from that one, I think a lot of the other ones, there's sufficient experience in the implementation and the outcome for us to have enough of a foundation to build a model around it.
Mike, sitting in the world of trying to collect and even show the department what data they already have, whether they know it or not, do you feel like there is enough data that's been made available already that some more of these policy questions, like Lynn's question, are actually already answerable? The data has never been collected and looked at in this way.
Yeah, I think so. Just the sheer volume of data that's available. But it goes back to one of my points I made, that some of this is not necessarily a technology problem. Some of it is a culture problem. The stovepiping of data and trying to break that down. There's a little bit of protecting rice bowl. Information is power in some instances. And I think breaking down those barriers of opening up and making the data visible, transparent to the stakeholders that need it. I think some of those issues are, some of those cultural things are other things that are going to be as important at getting at as the technology itself, kind of a change management piece of it.
That's interesting you mentioned that rice bowl problem, because I've seen that. For example, you go to the contractors, if you want to know what's really going on in a program, they've got all the right data to tell you, right? But unfortunately, beyond the program office, it's usually very hard to understand and actually get access to that contractor data. There's something called knowledge graphs. It's other research that AIRC has done that could help with that. So basically, you would have outside of that rice bowl at least a fundamental understanding of what data they had, and that potentially could give you access to it through other means.
So circling back to the original question, so if Lynn can give you metrics that she's trying to optimize for, and Mike asserts that there are ways now to make it easier to collect and sort through data and give people access to, so then it gets back to, can you turn my policy question into a model? And Doug, there's got to be things you can't turn into models, but there might be some styles of questions that are easier to turn into models. So for potential users here, what are the styles of questions that don't try that one? Like what could possibly go wrong if we split AT&L in half kind of question, right? Like, not that anyone ever asked that. So, and then other questions could be more answerable. So what's your guidance on what's a reasonable question to give to a policy test lab?
So good question. Right now I just know mathematically in my, my background, there are ways at getting at data. Like I just mentioned, the knowledge graph, there are other ways. I can think of 2 or 3 others right now. I don't want to geek out on you, but I would say right now, I would postulate there are methods that would allow us to handle the problem. But the key is going to be whether or not, once you've actually done it and the model, and compare the model to the eventual new data coming out, right? Can I do that predictive? I would say for the most part, a lot of the modeling we do can't be exactly predictive. It's going to have uncertainty bounds, right? So we can say, well, it should be in this realm over here. And maybe that's good enough, but then maybe it's not. It all depends on the question, right? In the area.
If we reframe the question to enabling your tool to help the Department of Defense in implementing policy, is that an easier question to perhaps navigate at this stage, is to say, okay, Congress just passed this law. How can we help the Department of Defense move forward in implementation? Because I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat about, speed. How much time do you need? Where's the lag? And I'm curious if you see use of your tool in also basically navigating the agency implementation of this, and what would that look like?
Well, I'm going to go back to if I have an existing model, it's a lot easier to modify that existing model than it is to create something from scratch. Okay, so I've got this ERAM model from aerospace. I got a discrete event. I can tell you using the JSIDS example, right? And so those were discussions that were happening 2 years ago, right? But I could have gone off and modeled it 2 years ago because we already had that kind of information. Now the question is, well, what do you want to put in place? So that's a very tractable thing. I can probably do right now, even as complex as the models are. But the thing is being able to do it in this tool and having the tool do it and accelerate, right? Instead of 2 years, we're down to like a month. I mean, that's fundamentally our goal. And then being able to let the stakeholders and the subject matter experts look at the results. Build a collaborative environment. Get in here, take a look at the results, and do you agree? If you were to play with these parameters, sir or ma'am, how would you tweak it in your subject matter area? So I would say right now the sky's the limit. But we'll just have to, wait and see in terms of the kinds of questions we get, and then the development progress of the tool itself.
I want to ask one more question and then we'll go to closing here. This is for Mike and Doug. How do you think about the provenance of the data sources provided to either, Mike, your company trying to show the department what it can already do with its existing data, or to feed these models? How do you work on selecting what should be in and out of these analysis? And how is the provenance of the data permanently then attached to the analysis so that people can refer back to, basically kind of like referring back to the assumptions? So Mike, how do you think about that from a company perspective now?
Yeah, we scrape over 1,000 sources of data, publicly available information. We're starting to layer it with the bonded data and other obligation and expenditure data. And for us, we take everything back to the original source doc. So as you're going through our platform and you want to know about the budget data, there is a way to go back to the original JBook page. If a company is looking for an RFP that is out there, they can click on a button in a program area. They can click on a button that goes right to the paragraph of the RFP that was released by the organization, appropriations tables, those kind of things. So where we can, we take everything, we preserve the lineage, kind of goes back to our ontology of a common language. Go back to the originating source for all those, so there's no question on where it came from.
How do you handle issues of data provenance?
Well, right now I'm with Mike 110%. I mean, we want to trace it back to the right source, right? I just know in my experience in the Pentagon trying to, clean data. I mean, sometimes I can spend 2 or 3 months carefully going through a large data set. I can think of one right now where I got from GAO. It literally took me 3 months to clean it to where I was able to use it for what I wanted to try and do. And so getting that source truth and, I would say methods for doing that cleaning, and then make it as clean as possible when we get it, right? So that it's not corrupted.
Great. With that, I want to give the panelists a chance to close out here. Love to get your thoughts on what you've heard over this hour, and then ideas on the steps you'd like to see the department take to make more use of Policy Test Lab capabilities. So Lynn, you want to go first?
Thanks, Rand. I want to add my thanks to Doug for all the work he's done on this. I know that what's proposed here hasn't been easy this far, and it's not going to be a hop, skip, and a jump forward. There's a lot of complexity here, as we've talked about, but I think it's worthy work. I think that the value of having a data-informed model simulation can help in a lot of ways. Even if it's just to help us eliminate quickly the bad policy, right? Even if that's the loudest voice in the room, maybe it's the worst policy, and maybe running it through the simulator can help us eliminate that, so we can focus on how to move forward to resolve the matter. But I do think that there's a lot of promise here. I'm excited to be a part of the conversation today. I want to applaud the AIRC for having this first. I think it's an inaugural session, but hopefully there'll be more of these kind of conversations around issues like this. And I really do think that a lot of the value here is connecting the disparate sources of information and perspectives and bringing them together in a collaborative way through this model, in a way that I can only achieve now by having a bunch of different meetings, a bunch of different conversations, and trying to pull in key stakeholders to seek their views and opinions. And so I think that collaboration and bringing together that data from diverse perspectives will hopefully render better outcomes in policy making that will ease the burden on the department, with hopefully better policies being more clearly enacted such that it makes implementation more feasible, and takes off some of the burden that they have just in going through and trying to implement the DFARS cases and those sorts of things. So I'm excited about this. I look forward to learning more, and thanks again for having me.
Thanks, Lynn. Mike?
Yeah, first off, I would echo Lynn's comments. Hats off to Doug on this. I think it is a critically important effort to drive forward. I spent a couple of assignments while I was in the Air Force at the intersection of the executive branch and the legislative branch. And it was interesting that in both positions over multiple years, we would advance legislative initiatives thinking that they would answer the problem we're trying to solve, get implemented, and realize it didn't. And then it would take like 2 to 3 legislative cycles to really get the outcome that we were seeking, which is a monumental waste of time, energy, money, etc. But there was no other alternative. There was no way to really understand what that impact was going to be. So I'm very excited about the prospects here. I think I outlined kind of the 3 problems I saw: the fragmentation, the ontology, and the data latency. But I also think the culture piece of it is as important as a problem to get after as you go to implementation.
Thanks, Mike. Doug, I'm not going to ask you to brag about yourself, so instead I'm going to
No, in fact, I'm going to say, it's not just me. Okay. I pointed to other people on there. Those are the ones that have actually been helping me hands-on keyboard, right? But I mean, we've had great input from Dinesh Verma, Phil Antone. I mean, you, Arun. I mean, the list goes on. And when we get these slides put out there for everyone, I've got a slide in there thanking everybody for all their inputs. I've just been the guy taking all the information and trying to sort it out and go, okay, how do I get from A to B? I think Stephanie Halcrow had the greatest input, is like, I just want to be able to sit down and type out a policy question and then get it answered, which I'm like, I can't do that unless I go to like a Chat GPT, right? So that, right there kind of, backed me way up and said, okay, this is how I need to handle this problem. But I think Mike has got some absolutely fundamental points. For example, how do we build trust in it? Just like you do any other model, you're going to have to get it pinned to data. And so, we've got to do that part. His ontology point is well taken. Right now, I'm depending on the agents to help that negotiation. With an agentic AI-based thing, I tell one agent it's a child, and I tell another agent it's the parent, right? You got to communicate between the two. So there's ways forward that I think we can do, but there's a lot of work left to get people utilizing the tool. It's just a tool. It's not replacing people. I think it's going to help people, and you're going to still need people in the entire ecosystem as we get it built out. So that's all I've got. Thanks.
And Doug, if people in the department or in industry want to get access to the lab and work with you, supply you data sets or questions, how can they do that?
That's going to be through our normal channels in OSD. And so, I can provide a couple of names if they need POCs to where they can then start working with us and trying to figure out how to work with us.
Well, that's great. With that, I want to thank our panelists, Lynn, Mike, Doug, for a really great presentation and discussion, and a really interesting preview of what could possibly happen if we start making use of these policy test labs to improve the process of developing some of these NDAs or regulatory or organizational changes. For the audience, the recording of this webinar will be shared soon. I'd invite you all to please register for our next AIRC Insights session, which is going to be on May 26th. You can go to acqirc.org/events. Please follow AIRC on LinkedIn for updates on acquisition research and all the great research that's going on at AIRC. And thanks to our panelists and all the audience for participating in today's session.